Chapter 1. Return to Montauk. In the summer of 1993, musician Denny Colt was visiting Montauk after a year-long gig in Spain. Having been out of the country and away from her home on Long Island, she had not heard a word about the Montauk Project Experiments in Time. As she made her way to the top of the Montauk Lighthouse, while sightseeing, she couldn't help but notice a very odd structure on the bluffs of the state park. This was a large radar dish that was very conspicuous. Her intuition told her there was something funny about it, and she expressed that she wanted to find out what it was all about. Two other women overheard her and said they had just been out there. Having been warned off by nasty officials, they were told that it was top secret and to stay away from the area. Denny became suspicious and determined to find out what this was really all about. She took a picture of the radar and headed back. The very same evening, Denny made her way to the home of Lori Saluzzi, who happens to be a good friend of mine. No sooner had Denny arrived than she was handed a flyer that read Montauk and Synchronicity, which gave information on a lecture I would be giving. Denny has had several synchronous experiences in her life, and receiving this flyer on her return from Montauk was just one more. Consequently, she learned about the Montauk book and showed up at the lecture. Upon meeting her, Denny immediately told me about the radar and would soon show me a picture of the installation. This called for a trip to Montauk. Preston, Denny, and I headed out to the lighthouse in order to investigate what was going on. By early afternoon, we arrived at the radar installation. It was due west of the lighthouse and less than a mile away. There was a large trailer and generator next to a radar dish that was spinning. It was all positioned next to a large underground bunker, which has since been sealed up. No one was at the facility when we arrived, but there was a very lame sign which said not to go past a certain point. We didn't violate the sign, but proceeded to circle around the entire bunker so that we could go approach the area from another vantage point. Walking along the road, we were surprised to see a large flock of birds sitting on a telephone line leading to the base. Oddly, over 90% of the birds were headed in the same direction. They were almost frozen. We yelled and threw rocks to see if we could shake them up, but only for a few responded. Only a few moved, actually. The birds continued to sit there and didn't move during our vigil. Later in the day, Preston would videotape them flying in a frenetic pattern. They were flying in a circular pattern as if following a vortex or the like. It was incredibly strange behavior. The road we followed led around to the other side of the radar. There was no sign from this angle, and we could approach it directly. Once we got to within 100 yards, two cars drove up to the installation. 6 or 7 people got out, and some of them obviously worked at the facility. They were nicely dressed and appeared to be engineer type. An Oriental photographer also accompanied them. As 2 of the men got out of the car, they hurried immediately to the radar. One of them made overly zealous gestures with his arms and seemed to be explaining the radar to the other one. It all seemed rather corny, and we had to wonder if the man was trying to convince us of something. Preston approached the site and spoke to one of the men. He admitted working for the Cardion Radar Company in the function of public relations. Cardion manufactures radar systems and is located in the Long Island town of Syosset. The PR man said the radar was being tested and showcased for a foreign country that was interested in preventing small drug boats from coming ashore. He pointed to the ocean and said there was a small boat out there that they were testing. I couldn't see it. Even if I did see a boat, the area was ripe for fishing, and it could have been a sportsman. The PR man's story was ludicrous. Preston observed that this was a sophisticated piece of radar and certainly not one that needed to be tested for seeking out small boats. That type of radar had been on the market for years. Upon returning home, I called up one of my friends and was telling him about the radar at Montauk. Ironically, he informed me that Cardian is one of his clients. He said he would ask around and find out what he could. A few days later, he told me that we had indeed been fed a PR line. The story relayed to him was that the military was trying to find a way of detecting militant Arabs in the Middle East. Low levels of radioactive fiber were being introduced into the diet of certain Arab countries so that potential terrorists or soldiers could be picked up on radar screens. This principle is something referred to as barium screening. In medicine, one coats the inside of the intestinal tract with barium, and it shows up on an X-ray. This was supposed to be a new kind of advanced radar that would pick up the barium. I relayed my friend's story to Preston, and he was amazed. He said that the story doesn't hold water because even certain types of backpack radar will pick up people walking and distinguish them from animals. No such new or sophisticated radar was even necessary. It was obvious that we were being fed two stories from Cardian that were smokescreens for a secret agenda. There were other oddities noticed about the radar. The PR man had told us that it was 3 gigahertz, but we would eventually find out that it was 6 gigahertz. An additional oddity was that the radar was pointed at the ground for some reason. The radar also interfered with the viewfinder of Preston's video camera by interrupting the picture. Usually this would also create an effect on the camera chips inside, but this was not the case in this instance. According to Preston, this indicated that it was not normal electromagnetic radar, but something else. He didn't know what at this point. After we returned home from our trip to Montauk, there was a lot of pondering over the radar installation at the Montauk base. It didn't make sense. Most obvious was that Cardian could have chosen a testing site that was only 20 minutes away from their facility in Silsit. Instead, they chose Montauk, a location which was about 2.5 hours away. Preston decided to consult his friend Clark, a man who has many family connections in the defense industry. Clark said he knew someone who was being assigned to Montauk from the Siemens Corporation of New Jersey. His assignment included setting up a new radar installation on the inner base itself. Although this system could have been complementary to or an extension of the radar installation on the bluffs, it was in a different physical locale. Those who are World War II history buffs will recognize Siemens as the same company that did all the electronic work for the Third Reich. This is just one more revelation in what is a continuing pattern of Nazi connections to Montauk. A quick trip to the public library would also inform me that Siemens acquired that Cardian Corporation in the early 1990s. Everything now made a little more sense. I recalled the story of Norman Scott, an influential lobbyist on Capitol Hill who had almost completed a documentary about Montauk. His research led him to Siemens in Germany, at which point he ended up with a mysterious heart ailment. After recovering, he begged off the Montauk investigation. There were still many unanswered questions, but it was rather obvious that the historical German connections to Montauk were very much alive. Preston then decided he could obtain more information about the radar by flying over Camp Hero and videotaping the entire area. He soon discovered it was difficult to find a pilot who would fly over the base. Finally, he secured a charter from the East Hampton Airport. The pilot was anxious about going over the base and tried to end the trip after one passover, but Preston insisted he go back. They circled over the base a few more times, and some footage was obtained that would prove to be quite interesting. Upon Preston's return, he sat down and reviewed the entire tape with his friend Danny, a nuclear physicist. Danny soon had Preston stop the videotape. He was struck by the fact that there was a huge circle south of the inner Montauk base. According to Danny, this circular structure looked exactly like a particle accelerator. None of this was taken lightly, as Danny is one of only a small number of people in America who really understands the nuts and bolts of particle acceleration. He could actually build one. Without seeing further footage, Danny predicted what else would be seen at the site. With one minor exception, he was exactly correct. We were being told that there was a real particle accelerator on the grounds of the Montauk State Park. For you civilians, in simple terms, a particle accelerator is a device which creates energy by increasing the speed of nuclear particles towards the speed of light. I can give a little further technical description a little bit later on in this reading. When you consider the idea that barium might reflect particle beam radar, the picture begins to clarify. Earlier, we had been told by my friend who had connections at Cardian that barium was being fed into people so that they could be viewed on a radar screen. This story didn't make sense. Didn't make any sense, as people can be viewed on ordinary radar devices. But what if particle beam radar had been developed? This would explain why they were trying out a new radar system at Montauk. Aside from any vortex monitoring or other possible esoteric activities they had going, they at least needed to hook up the particle accelerator at Montauk. If it was ordinary radar testing, it could have been done locally near soil sets. The Cardian radar was obviously not what they said it was. At least 2 lines of disinformation had been set up. One was to tell the general public that it was for hunting down drug boats. The second story was more technical, but still flawed. They claimed to be using barium to detect people. If any part of that disinformation line was true, disinformation is loaded with truth if it is done properly, just so you know, for you civilians. It was probably the statement that the radar would detect the barium. This indeed backs up Danny's contention even that the circle at Montauk is a particle beam accelerator. We didn't have to convince him, as he was sure of it. The fact that he is one of only a small number of people who have a mastery of particle beam physics made us pretty convinced too. We still don't know exactly what the barium is for. It is not to track military intruders, but it could possibly be used to track people, and more speculatively, to lock into their psychic signatures. Our investigation continued, and we went out to Montauk once again and explored the circle in person. This time we were accompanied by Mike Nichols and Denny Colt. The circle was paved and it looked like it had been kept up. The bushes were trimmed to some degree, but not too much. We found a patch of pavement that was much newer than the rest. This was exactly like Danny described. He said that there would be a paved area that would periodically be lifted up with a crane for maintenance purpose. Afterwards, it would be repaved. All of us who made the visit to the circle had reactions afterwards. Mike got very tired and disoriented. Denny was tired, but also developed a red triangular blotch on her neck. I became extremely ill with a headache, the likes of which I had never had. Preston was perhaps the most affected. He had radiation burns on his legs and chest. A doctor verified they were radiation burns, but didn't want to go on the record for his own personal reasons. I personally saw a Geiger counter react when it was placed next to the burned areas on Preston's body. The trip to investigate the circle not only substantiated Danny's contention that it was a particle accelerator, it provided some other interesting information as well. Before we set out to the circle, Preston had set up various radio receivers even, in an attempt to pick up the transmissions, any transmissions emanating from the base. He was able to monitor different transmissions, but as soon as he was fully set up, they would cease. As soon as he'd take down the equipment, they would start back up again. This went on a few times and was readily observable, but was irritating. Preston figured that Montauk crew was toying with him and ceased the operation. As we sat in the lighthouse parking lot, a local media person approached us. He took one look at the antenna on Preston's van and wanted to know if we were looking for aliens. He started giggling, and thereafter I referred to him as Giggles. Giggles is a surfer, twice removed, and was getting ready to go down to the beach. He said he had lived in the area his entire life and that Montauk is indeed a very strange place. He said it all has to do with electromagnetic phenomena. Those were his words, not ours. Giggles acknowledged that the people in the town don't understand the phenomena and can be quite peculiar at times. He understands it and just goes about his own business without making waves. According to him, the best way to approach the Montauk locals is to go get a surfboard and hang out. If they think you are a local, they might talk candidly about certain phenomena. Giggles said that surfing off Montauk Point had a very special energy quality. He compared it to Hawaii. I do believe that Giggles knew more than he was willing to talk about. He was certainly right about surfers being considered innocuous. Earlier that morning, our friend Mike Nichols was surfing and noticed the Cardian radar. He saw some workers starting up the generator and asked what they were doing. One of the workers was friendly and said that it hadn't been functioning in the underground. They were trying to get it working. Mike was too stunned to ask any questions. He went home and phoned us. Little did he know that we were headed out to Montauk that very same day. He phoned us just before we left, and we were able to connect up with him. After Giggles went down to the beach, another surfer came up and noticed Preston monitoring different electronic equipment in his van. He identified himself as Ray and asked what we were doing. Preston said that he was trying to find out what was going on at the base. Ray said he wished that someone would find out what was happening because he lived near the base and was often woken in the middle of the night by helicopters. He said they had been letting off huge amounts of equipment and people. In fact, it irritated him so much that he went down to the base and complained. The officer in charge was very nasty and an argument ensued. Ray eventually called the police, who told him there was nothing they could do. Disturbing the peace is apparently out of their jurisdiction, unless it is a curiosity seekers trespassing on Camp Hero. We were later told by a town official that the soldiers on the base would have been the National Guard on bivouac training exercises. As the base had been declared a toxic and hazardous area, according to George Larson, state park supervisor, and also backed up by a federal contract bid. Something doesn't make sense. If the base is contaminated, it would be idiotic to have troops camp out in the midst of this toxicity. It was also out of the place for the military to be so nasty to a civilian if they were just doing routine exercises. All the events in this chapter serve to show that the strange goings on at Montauk haven't gotten any less strange. We were right in our element. A novel radar installation on a state park, reports of irregular and unfriendly military activity, and the police acting helpless, just like the 1950s movie Invaders from Mars. To top it off, someone even mentioned the underground. What would be next? Indeed, soul soldiers, what would be next? What will be next? Stay tuned for the next episode of the Umbanda Soul Soldiers Pyramids of Montauk, something or other. Namaste. Namaskaram.